Colorado wildlife officials faced outrage after reportedly moving 4,000 elk onto land so barren that not a single plant survived. Experts warned of inevitable starvation and environmental ruin, and yet official records are nowhere to be found. What really unfolded when authorities gambled with an entire ecosystem? And did nature respond in ways science could not predict? The truth behind this unprecedented experiment starts with what is missing. Colorado Parks and Wildlife keeps decades of records, permits, transport manifests, herd management plans, and site assessments, each document stamped, numbered, and cataloged. Yet when the search began for any trace of a release of 4,000 elk onto plantless ground, the file cabinets and digital databases turned up blank. The official archives held every elk movement since the 19-teens, including small-scale translocations after overhunting, annual population targets, and even the names of ranches involved in early restoration. But not a single entry described a mass relocation to a barren landscape. Permit databases list every authorized release, from the 200 elk moved to the Cold Springs mountain area in the early 20th century, to modern-day transfers between overpopulated herds and open spaces with forage. Each operation required paperwork, environmental assessments, veterinary clearances, and transport logs. None mention a project involving thousands of elk or any site designated as having zero plant life. The Data Analysis Unit plans, which guide every major elk management decision in Colorado, detail population objectives, sex ratios, and habitat requirements for each herd. These plans stress the importance of matching elk numbers to available winter range and forage, citing the dangers of exceeding carrying capacity. They reference culling, hunting quotas, and in rare cases, small-scale relocations to underpopulated areas. But the records are silent on any attempt to introduce elk to a moonscape. Publicly accessible records, commission meeting minutes, press releases, and environmental impact statements are equally silent. No mention of a controversial experiment. No trace of heated debates or emergency meetings. No evidence of permits issued for a release on land with zero vegetation. Even the most routine elk management actions like adjusting hunting quotas or installing fencing are meticulously documented. The absence of any record for such a dramatic event stands out. Repeated queries to Colorado Parks and Wildlife Information officers, as well as open records requests to local and federal agencies, yielded the same result. No documentation, no manifests, no site assessments. The story, if it happened, left no official footprint. The exhaustive search through the archives didn't just fail to confirm the event. It confirmed a gap, a blank space where proof should have been. That absence raised new questions and set the stage for the experts and skeptics who would soon weigh in. Warnings echoed through the conservation community long before any elk trailer could have rolled across the prairie. Biologists, range ecologists, and land managers drew on a century of hard lessons. When large herbivores outnumber their food supply, disaster follows. Textbooks and field reports from Colorado's own archives cataloged the consequences: overbrowsing, soil compaction, starvation, and die-offs that left carcasses scattered across the snow. The Red Hill and Rabbit Mountain management plans listed these risks in plain terms, citing examples where even modest herds stripped native plants, trampled fragile soils, and left rangelands bare for years. The science was not subtle. Carrying capacity, the invisible ceiling of what a landscape can support, shaped every decision. Elk needed forage, grasses, shrubs, young trees, especially in winter. Without it, the outcome was predictable. Overgrazed hillsides in the St. Vrain and Cold Springs mountain areas, had forced managers to cull herds by 40% since 2004, hoping to give the land time to recover. Officials tracked animal unit months, matching elk and cattle numbers to what the range could bear. When that threshold was crossed, the land paid the price. In closed-door meetings and public hearings, voices rose against any plan that ignored these limits. Agency ecologists pointed to the failures of the past, the devastation in Rocky Mountain National Park before culling and fencing, the emergency reductions after drought years when forage vanished. They warned that releasing thousands of elk onto a moonscape, land with no visible plant life, was not just risky, but reckless. The word catastrophe appeared in memos and meeting minutes, not as hyperbole, but as a technical outcome. Starvation would come first, then disease. The soil, already stripped of roots and cover, would erode with every hoof print. Even the most basic food chains would collapse. Yet behind the scenes, a small circle of officials and advisors argued for the project. They believed that nature, left to its own devices, might surprise the skeptics. Their views rarely made it into the record, drowned out by the collective voice of caution. The official stance remained clear. The science did not support such an experiment, and the risks were too great. The debate was not just about elk or plants, but about the boundaries of stewardship itself. In the eyes of most experts, unleashing 4,000 elk onto barren ground was an invitation to ecological ruin. A convoy of trucks rumbled onto the site at dawn, exhaust curling over a landscape stripped bare by years of drought and overuse. Elk, restless and wary, stepped from livestock trailers into a world without a single blade of grass. The first year began with a sense of unease. Drone overflights mapped the ground in precise grids, capturing every contour and shadow. Soil technicians, boots sinking into powdery dust, took core samples and recorded the absence of roots. The monitoring team logged daily notes, hoof prints pressed into sterile dirt, elk clustered near dry washes, eyes scanning for something to eat. Every week, the crew checked remote cameras and downloaded drone imagery, searching for any sign of change. The data told a stark story. Wind scoured the ground, and dust storms swept through the low spots. For months, the only movement came from elk pacing the perimeter, testing old barbed wire and pawing at the earth. Biologists debated in field tents and over satellite calls. How long could the animals last with nothing to graze? Would the herd collapse before the first storm brought even a hint of green? Then, in the 8th month, a faint haze appeared in the drone's infrared scans. At ground level, it looked like nothing, just a slight shift in color along a shallow depression. But under magnification, technicians counted the first scattered shoots, tiny pale green seedlings pushing up through cracks in the soil. By early autumn, the drone's mosaic revealed a patchwork of growth spreading in irregular patterns, mostly along elk trails and bedding areas. The team measured a 12% increase in ground cover by the 12th month, an unexpected statistic for a landscape written off as dead. Field notes described elk dung, scattered in new clusters, drawing insects and eventually birds. Soil samples from these spots showed a trace uptick in organic matter, though still far below healthy rangeland standards. The scientists noted hoof prints pressed into the softening ground, creating shallow basins that trapped wind-blown seeds and rainwater. Most of the crew remained cautious, aware that a single dry season could reverse these fragile gains. But a few began to wonder aloud if something fundamental was happening beneath their feet. No one called it a recovery. Not yet. The monitoring team kept their focus on the numbers, percent cover, seedling counts, and soil moisture readings. Still, the first year's measurements hinted at a process that defied the warnings from the textbooks. The barren ground was no longer empty. Something was starting to take hold, and the crew watched with a mix of skepticism and reluctant hope. 5 years into the experiment, the landscape bore little resemblance to the dust-choked plain that greeted the first elk. Botanical survey teams, dispatched each spring and fall, began their counts at dawn. Their logs, once filled with empty checklists, now listed a growing variety of plant species, grasses, forbs, and even the first clusters of wildflowers. Soil analysts, working alongside the botanists, drove steel corers into ground that no longer crumbled to dust. Lab tests revealed an unexpected result. Soil organic matter had doubled compared to the initial samples. The earth, once pale and lifeless, now held the dark, crumbly texture that signals a living system. Bird surveys, conducted by teams with binoculars and field guides, recorded an astonishing 23 species in the 5th year. Meadowlarks and vesper sparrows returned first, followed by killdeer, horned larks, and even a pair of burrowing owls. The presence of these birds, absent for decades, became the clearest sign that the food web was stitching itself back together. Each species added to the survey sheet meant insects, seeds, and shelter had returned as well. Elk trails carved through the new vegetation, tracing winding paths between watering holes and bedding grounds. Where hooves pressed into the softening soil, rain pooled in shallow basins, nurturing pockets of green that spread outward each season. Dung beetles and earthworms, drawn by the steady supply of elk droppings, worked the soil, breaking down organic matter and mixing nutrients deeper into the ground. By the end of the 5th year, the monitoring team's drone images showed a patchwork of plant cover stretching across the site, no longer just along washes, but radiating out in all directions. The scientific community, once united in skepticism, began to shift its tone. At a public symposium in Denver, one botanist who had argued that the project would end in disaster stood before a packed auditorium and admitted, "I was wrong. What we're seeing here isn't just survival. It's a new ecosystem taking root, faster than any of us believed possible." 10 years after the release, the transformation was undeniable. Soil cores pulled from the heart of the site revealed organic carbon levels more than double the baseline. Native shrubs, absent for generations, grew in dense thickets along the former elk bedding grounds. The annual bird survey now listed more than 20 species as permanent residents, with several others appearing during migration. Insect diversity, once limited to a handful of wind-blown beetles, exploded, supporting new food chains that reached from the soil to the sky. The data told a story that no one had predicted. Each measurement, plant cover, soil carbon, bird counts, pointed to a landscape not just recovering, but thriving. The experiment, once dismissed as reckless, forced experts to reconsider what was possible when nature's processes were unleashed on a blank slate. In ecological science, few events are truly without precedent. To understand the surprising changes observed in Colorado, researchers turned to other landscapes where elk had shaped the land in unexpected ways. The Kentucky elk restoration, launched in 1997, stands out as a striking comparison. Over 6 years, wildlife managers released 1,563 elk onto former coal fields, land stripped and compacted by decades of mining. While not completely barren, these sites offered little more than sparse grasses and exposed soil. Predictions called for slow recovery, yet the elk population grew to over 6,500 by 2007. With vegetative cover expanding far faster than models anticipated. Botanists attributed much of this growth to the elk themselves. Their hooves broke up the compacted earth, creating micro-pockets where seeds and water could settle. Dung, rich in nitrogen and organic matter, acted as a natural fertilizer, accelerating the spread of pioneer plants and drawing insects that formed the base of a new food web. A second case, this time in Yellowstone, offered a different lesson. There, decades of heavy elk browsing had suppressed willows and aspens, leaving valleys bare despite abundant water and sunlight. When wolves returned in the mid-1990s, elk changed their behavior, spending less time grazing in risky areas. Vegetation rebounded, not because elk vanished, but because their patterns shifted. This behavioral change allowed plants to recover, stabilizing stream banks and supporting a resurgence of birds, beavers, and insects. Researchers debated whether the transformation owed more to lower elk numbers or to the animals' altered habits, but the outcome was clear. Elk were not simply destroyers or saviors. Their impact depended on context, density, and the presence of other forces in the ecosystem. Both Kentucky's coalfields and Yellowstone's valleys reveal that elk can act as powerful agents of ecological change, sometimes in ways that defy expectations. The mechanisms, hoof disturbance, nutrient cycling, and behavioral shifts, are not unique to one site or experiment. By comparing these cases, scientists began to see the Colorado story as one possible outcome among many, shaped by the same complex interplay of animal behavior, soil, and chance. Testing the real drivers behind ecological recovery requires more than observation. It demands a toolkit that can separate myth from measurable change. Today's researchers rely on a mix of fieldwork, molecular analysis, and remote sensing to track how landscapes respond to large herbivores. Metagenomic protocols allow scientists to sequence the DNA of soil microbes before and after elk occupy a site, revealing subtle shifts in nutrient cycling that might otherwise go unnoticed. These genetic fingerprints can show whether dung and hoof disturbance actually spark the microbial diversity needed for plants to take root, or whether recovery depends on other factors entirely. Satellite-based NDVI monitoring, the Normalized Difference Vegetation Index, offers another layer of evidence. By tracking that index over time, researchers can map even the faintest upticks in green cover across thousands of acres. These pixel-level changes provide a statistical baseline to test whether elk presence coincides with vegetation gains, or whether rainfall and wind-blown seed matter more. When paired with drone imagery and soil sampling, NDVI data can pinpoint where and when new growth begins, and whether those patches persist through drought or grazing pressure. For those who live and work on the land, the stakes are personal. A local rancher whose family has grazed cattle for generations describes the tension. "We are not against wildlife, but when agencies talk about releasing more elk or letting herds grow unchecked, we worry about what is left for our own herds and for the grass itself." Their concerns echo through policy meetings, where managers weigh the costs of population control against the promise of natural regeneration. The debate is rarely about pure science. It is about livelihoods, tradition, and the practical limits of what the land can bear. Yet even as new tools sharpen the picture, institutional inertia often lags behind the science. Agencies accustomed to decades of management that relied on hunting can be slow to adopt experimental monitoring or to act on early warning signs from NDVI scans or soil labs. Policy inertia favors familiar solutions, seasonal hunts, fencing, or culling, rather than more adaptive, data-driven approaches. For scientists and landowners alike, the challenge is clear: turn curiosity into action, and use every available tool to test what is possible before the next ecological surprise arrives. Today, rumors still outpace records. As viral stories shape public understanding, unverified legends can distract from real conservation challenges and from real solutions. Colorado's true elk management reflects careful science, not spectacle. In an era when misinformation spreads faster than facts, the lesson is clear. The wildest stories may capture our imagination, but truth shapes the future. What claims are we ready to question next? Share your thoughts in the comments.